going live today because there were some things that, of course, have been happening that I wanted to discuss. And namely, I wanted to discuss how our adversaries actually think versus the misconceptions that people often see being portrayed in the MSM narratives. So, I wanted to bring up that the Russians have never actually said that they would carry out a first strike. There are only a few instances by which they would even consider doing such a thing, and that would be if their nation, if it's existential to the point that their country is about to be either overrun or destroyed. Like, say, if somebody actually launched a strike on them, then of course they would retaliate, or in the highly unlikely event, and this would be extremely unlikely, that another nation would actually invade Russian soil. That would be the only two instances by which they would actually carry out a nuclear strike. So, a lot of times, when people actually listen to the Russians talking, the media spin tends to portray it as them saying that they're going to nuke us without, just without any context, without any factual basis to it. They're portraying it as if Russia's saying that they're going to actually carry out a first strike when they've never said such a thing. I don't know how many times I have to say this, but people just don't listen. People would rather go to people that don't know what the hell they're talking about, that want to just, flap away about, nukes this, nukes that. It's not going to happen the way people think it's going to happen. Now, what's going to happen is there's going to be an expansion, conventionally speaking, because Russia doesn't have to use nukes. I'm not sure where the disconnect is, but the Russians do not actually have to use nukes because there's nobody that can threaten them conventionally. There's nobody that can defeat them conventionally, unless we're talking about China, but China is Russia's ally. China has the most powerful conventional forces on the face of the earth, so, and China being Russia's ally, is not going to invade Russia. They're not going to do that. So, I don't know in what universe people think that, the West has a chance to defeat Russia, but the West certainly does not have the chance to defeat Russia. I mean, we're talking about a country here, Russia, who has 3 times more forces in number than, and I'm talking about personnel, than Germany, Britain, France, and Italy all combined. They have 3 times more personnel than the 3 biggest Western European NATO contributors. I'm looking at the paper right now. 3.5 million for Russia, which is their active duty of 1.2 million, their reserves of 2 million. Yes, they have 2 million reserves, and 300,000 of their National Guard, which used to be called internal troops, which is Russia's paramilitary forces. Now, when we're talking about Germany, Britain, France, and Italy, they all, I've told people how weak those countries are militarily. I mean, they're extremely weak. Now, especially in the case of Germany, they've really let themselves go. From what they had at reunification in the 90s, Germany on paper had a large military with a lot of hardware. Sure, sure. It was a conscript army, but, so was the American army back in Vietnam. America had a large conscript army to fight the Vietnam War because our active duty forces had to be spread out in such a way during the Cold War to where they would give the conscripts a backbone if, say, a war would have broken out back then. So, of course, you had Americans stationed in Europe during the Cold War, in Italy and Germany, and of course, you had the Air Force bases in Britain. You had Americans in other areas too, like Turkey and other NATO nations. And this is back in the Cold War, what I'm talking about right now. Now, we had a conscript army all the way up until after the Vietnam War. That was when we transformed from a largely conscript military to a all volunteer military. And, most of the NATO nations in Europe have followed suit in that regard. Most of them have done away with their conscript forces and have followed suit and have now switched to an all volunteer force. But the problem lays with the fact that they're not maintaining all their hardware, and they don't have enough hardware for even a defensive war, much less any sort of offensive war. Now, the United States they do not have enough forces in Europe to directly challenge Russia. And even if they did try to do such a thing, it would very much be a suicidal endeavor, for a lack of a better thing to call it. It would get us embroiled in a conflict that we cannot win. There is no way for us to win a conflict with Russia, and there damn sure ain't no way for us to win a conflict with China. There's no way. There's just no way. I titled this The Adversarial Mind, and I put a photo of Wei Feng, the Chinese defense minister, who I call the Heinrich Himmler of the East, because he is the one that has said in his speech to the Chinese Politburo that he wants to not only colonize America, but he wants to genocide the American people and supplant the American people with Chinese. And he was a little more eloquent as to how he actually spoke the words, but he did in fact say it. He said that he wanted to replace Americans with good Chinese, and that the good Chinese would become good Americans, which is a really sick way of saying that he wants to supplant the American people, basically genocide and enslave them. Because I'm going to talk about how our adversaries think. While people are hung up on what these Western elites are doing, they're totally ignoring the fact that there's Eastern elites in China, in Russia, in India, in North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, all these other countries, the Eurasian bloc, the BRICS bloc, not the World Economic Forum, which I call the Western Economic Forum, but the BRICS, they are the East. They have a separate system. They control the issuance of their own currencies. The central banks in the East do not control the regimes or anything there. The regimes there control the central banks and the issuance of their currency. Unlike in the West, where you have the central banks and the bankster class controlling the regimes. So it's an opposite system between the West and the East. They're both entirely different systems. In the East, their elites are within the regimes themselves, whereas in the West, the elites are puppeteering the regimes and the people, the fake politics and everything else. They're puppeteering it. The politics in the West are a false globalist paradigm. So there's a lot of people that think that politics are still real. And I don't understand how anybody can believe that. How can anybody believe that they have a chance to influence the direction that things are going. And I'm talking about people that understand, these people fully understand that there's elites. I'm talking about I'm talking about the West now. There's people in the West who fully understand that there's elites that are puppeteering everything, and yet they still believe that they have the opportunity to impact things through elections, which, we know are selections. We know they're fake. We know politics is nothing more than WWF. It's wrestling. It's no different than WWF. It's totally fake. It's false. It's a fake globalist paradigm. It's totally false. But yet there's still people that believe that politics are real. Because if they believe in the elites, how then can they rationalize that politics are real? How can they think that they have an opportunity to make a difference with voting when they know there's elites? It blows my mind how people can still believe that politics are real, even though they already know that there's elites. You'll hear the same people say out of their same mouth that they acknowledge that there's a George Soros and all these different NGOs and color revolutions that are manipulated by the Western elites. They'll admit that, and then out of the other side of their mouth, they'll say that, oh, we got to vote for a Republican because that'll fix things. Okay, all right. So you don't think that the people that are doing these color revolutions are also controlling the politicians in the West? Okay, all right. Well, you're totally lost if that's what you believe, but, some people just don't get it, and they never will. But that's besides the point. I'm talking about the Eastern elites and what their plans are. That's the whole purpose of this live. The Russians and the Chinese, some people think that Russia is fighting globalism, but that's not true. Russia's not fighting globalism. They're fighting the Western elites for control over what the NWO is going to be. There's going to be an NWO, but it's either going to be an Eastern flavor or it's going to be a Western flavor. But the West has woefully castrated itself, its abilities, everything, and it has not the ability to make a difference whatsoever. It has not the ability to win any sort of conflict whatsoever. So like I've talked about in my last live, was that there was a change in the nuke policy for the USA. So, they are considering a policy whereby they would do a first strike policy, or a policy whereby they could actually use nukes against conventional threats. They're projecting onto Russia what they themselves are actually doing, okay? Russia and China are bad. They are bad. They are just as bad as these Western elites. But I have to be accurate in how I describe what's actually happening. I'm not going to feed you a line of total BS and corroborate any sort of false narratives, because they can't be corroborated. Because when you know what you know, then you know what you know. And what I know is that a lot of lies, because we live in the West, so our media is going to lie to us about the East, that there's a lot of inaccuracies about the whole narratives about what's happening with Russia. We already know this. We know they lie on Russia. And I don't care about Russia, but I want to tell the truth, because we all just want the truth. And the truth is that Russia is a very dangerous threat. They are a very dangerous threat, and they are way underestimated. And so is China as well. In fact, the real numbers, facts, figures, statistics, and everything else shows that Russia and China are drastically more powerful than we are, than the United States, than NATO. NATO cannot compete with China nor Russia. So I'm going to greet everybody in the chat here before I keep going because I have quite a bit I want to discuss as it relates to all this. So let me see. Hey there, Rebecca. Excellent to see you. I was thinking about you the other day. I was hoping you were doing all right. And Elizabeth and Jen. Good to see you, Jennifer. And let's see who else. Who else? Well, welcome everybody. Welcome. So here's oh hey Snafu. Hey. How you doing, buddy? Good to see you too. So here's the deal. A lot of narratives, false narratives about our enemies, Russia and China, are being proliferated due to the MSM. Now, Russia has mobilized their 300,000 reserves so that what that equates to is, if you've watched my hypotheticals, then you're well aware of what a combined arms army is, which is Russia's basically group army, because China has group armies and Russia has combined arms armies. And the Western nations typically have just armies or army groups. So what's going on is that they've mobilized the equivalent of 6 combined arms armies. Now, Russia has a large pool of reserves. Russia has 2 million reserves, just like the United States has reserves. We have reserves too that live in our civilian communities, and then they get called up in times of war. Well, so does Russia. So does every other nation on Earth. And Russia has mobilized 300,000 out of their 2 million man reserves so that they could send them to prepare for the invasion of Ukraine. Now, we know that so far, Russia hasn't even begun to try yet in Ukraine. They did what was called a limited incursion, what they call a quote-unquote special military operation, which has so far been largely a missile and artillery conflict with a little bit of mobile warfare here and there, like you've seen in Kharkov and a few other areas. But Russia did not send very many troops into the east, or the eastern parts of Ukraine, the LPR and DPR. They did not send that many troops in there so far. They've only sent 70 combat battalions, which is only, if you're going by average Russian battalion sizes, that is only 63 to 65,000 total troops, which isn't very much. And they have ground down the Ukrainian military to dust. I mean, we're seeing the Ukrainian military on their 7th or 8th round of mobilizations, like I've said before, to where they're even considering having to draft women because they're running so low on manpower. You've already seen all these videos of old men being used in different sectors of the Ukrainian front. There are also young people that are trying to get out of being mobilized in Ukraine. You know, they're running low on manpower. So Russia is building their forces up in Belgorod and also southern Belarus. And what they're going to do is, like I said about a week or two ago, well, not even 2 weeks ago, I said about a week ago that they're most likely going to strike and carry out their full-scale invasion when the ground has fully froze, so that their armor doesn't get stuck in the rain and the mud, because at this time of year, what you have in Eastern Europe, which is a problem that Nazi Germany faced when they invaded the USSR back in 1941, they faced the issue in the fall of 1941, the Rasputitsa, which is the rains that cause massive muds, which causes large armored vehicles to get stuck in the muds. So what Russia's doing right now is they're finishing up their buildup. They're moving everything into position, all their armor, all their mechanized infantry formations, all their, basically, like I said, their armor, their tanks, which is their tanks, their mechanized infantry formations, their air defense assets, electronic warfare assets, logistical assets, helicopters, the whole nine. They're moving all of that into position right now because what they're going to do is they're going to finish off Ukraine. Ukraine will not be a sovereign nation after this because they refused to go to the negotiating table, and they refused to negotiate with Russia because the Minsk Accords were violated, which is why Russia even invaded Ukraine with their limited incursion in the first place, because France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine all sat down because, remember, after the Maidan Revolution, the whole issue in the East, where they had a conflict, began shortly thereafter. Because there's ethnic Russians there, and the ethnic Russians felt like they were being oppressed, so they fought back. The Ukrainians wanted to suppress the ethnic Russians. Russia sat back and didn't even do anything, basically, other than arm and equip their proxies, which their proxies were the LPR and DPR forces. This is a little recent history lesson I'm giving here. So they armed and equipped their proxies. They sat back, did nothing until finally, they started the Minsk Accords. They got two NATO nations to agree to it, France and Germany, to sit down, hash these plans out for their accords, to where they were trying to set up a situation whereby these regions, LPR and DPR, there would be a peace between them and the rest of Ukraine, and they would be granted some sort of semi-autonomy from the rest of the country. But because the Minsk agreements were violated by Zelensky, the Russians decided to finally get involved, so they preemptively went in there before the Ukrainians started they were to start a big offensive against the LPR and DPR. But the Russians preempted them, and they invaded first. And that's how we got into the situation that we're in now. That is the accurate history lesson that mainstream media, will not tell you. But you can find these things out on your own if you do your due diligence and go look these things up. These are facts. They can easily be found. So, in the adversarial mind of Russia and China, they are not good countries by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, they have their own evil plans, okay? But their evil plans have to do with what they're going to do to the West. They plan to take over the West, NATO and the United States. Now, because the Western militaries have let themselves slip into a state of decay, there is no way that once the Russians carry out their full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that the West can do anything to intervene in a successful way. And I just don't see that happening, because that will drag us into a war that we cannot win with our depleted, hollowed-out, woke military, with our very much diminished manufacturing capabilities of our military-industrial complex. We can't keep up with Russia, and we damn sure can't even keep up with China when it comes to the manufacture of vital weapons and equipment and gear. We cannot keep up with them. China has 40% of the whole world's manufacturing base. 40%, and I mean the entire world, of the whole world, sits in China. 40%. That is insane. Nobody can compete with China. Nobody. Nobody's industrial base, military industrial base, or civil industrial base comes anywhere near China. China ain't worried about the West. I can tell you that. China now, for the past 5 years, all the factory complexes, these gigantic, these nearly monolithic type of massive capabilities of these massive, enormous factory complexes that they started building back in the 90s, and that started to come online by the mid to late 2000 teens, we're talking like 2017, 2018, a lot of these additional factories. Now remember, China was already fairly industrialized with their military industrial complex. They already had a fairly decent manufacturing capability, but now with all these additional factories that they built, we're talking hundreds of enormous factories. Their capabilities have shot way up. Their ability to manufacture armored vehicles, munitions, missiles, aircraft, ships with their enormous amount of shipyards, 1,200 shipyards, any and all of which can be retooled at a moment's notice to mass produce military vessels. Even automotive and bus plants can be retooled. Not that they need it, they don't need it, but if they had to, if they felt they needed to, they could retool them at a moment's notice as per the civil military fusion policy of China. They have already set themselves up in such a way to where they can retool every shipyard and every automotive and bus plant to produce military vehicles or even munitions in some instances. They can add at any moment to their already enormous military industrial complex. Now, China is a much bigger threat than Russia. China is a massively bigger threat than Russia. Not that Russia isn't a threat. They are. Oh, yeah, they are. Russia is pretty big and bad itself, but it's nowhere near China big. It is not China big in any category. Now, we're talking about just demographically, the Russian population is only about 145 million. So they're just under half of our population. But they're close to half of our size in population. Now, Pakistan is China's other ally, which they have about 160 million people. Now, or I'm sorry, it's a little bigger than that. I think it's about like 170, 180. Pakistan's pretty big. Now, they also have North Korea, which North Korea only has like 25 million people, but still, China's massively bigger at 1.5 billion people than all of its other allies. All of them combined don't even come close to the population of China. China has enormous human resources. They have an enormous industrial base. They already have the most armored vehicles of any nation on earth. They have the biggest tank fleet. They have the biggest armor personnel and infantry fighting vehicle fleet. They have the biggest armored fighting vehicle fleet, which is like your armored trucks, your MRAPs, that are in addition. Also, if you combined their armored fighting vehicles with their armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, you would have 60,000 vehicles. 60,000. But if you're just talking about just the infantry fighting vehicles and armor personnel carriers, that's about 39,000. That's 39,000. And that's storage and everything. Now their tank fleet, all the tanks they have, all the ones in storage for their second and third line units, plus their active tanks, they have, hold on, let me get the paper, I have it. Hold on. China's tank fleet is gargantuan, it's enormous. If you're going by all the tanks China has, they have, let's see, they've got 19,300 main battle tanks, and they have 3,800 light tanks. So China's main battle tanks and light tanks combined are a grand total of 23,100 tanks. Russia's active tank fleet is 12,500, so it's about a little over half of that. So those are the two biggest armored fleets in the world. China first, of course, by a big gulf, and then you have Russia. Russia has about 30,000 IFVs and APCs, your infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. They have the second biggest tank fleet after China. Now, China and Russia both have insanely effective air defense networks, air defense artillery systems. They can hit everything from drones to helicopters to high-flying aircraft, all the way to satellites, because they even have anti-satellite weapons built into their air defense network. Like Russia has the S-500 and China has the HQ-9. HQ-9B, actually, I'm sorry. HQ-9B. That is their anti-satellite weapon. or actually, my bad. No, that's their high altitude air defense. Their FK 2000 is China's anti-satellite weapon system. So China and Russia have insanely good air defense networks, and some of China's air defense systems are decoy proof, meaning that decoys like chaff and flares do not trip up their air defense systems, meaning they'll still hit their target. Even if planes deploy chaff and flares, the missiles are still going to hit their target. So China has a very, very effective and massive air defense network. China has built enormous amounts of air defense systems. China and Russia are both about equal in artillery, too, and both of them have the most artillery out of all the nations on Earth. So let's talk about what's going to happen. Now, the way our adversaries think is they're not going to play games. As soon as the Russians are ready, they're going to overrun Ukraine and knock this hammer blow to NATO, because, like Jens Stoltenberg has said, that this would be such a massive blow to NATO because of all the weapons and ammunition and money that they sunk into this conflict. This would be such a massive hammer blow to them that they would fall apart after this. They would lose all credibility. They would lose, trust in one another, because they've castrated themselves and not maintained their capabilities for so long. For them to have given all these weapons away to a failing proxy, their proxy is not going to win. There is no path to victory for their proxy. Ukraine is going to lose. That's a guarantee. So what's going to happen is that after all of these weapons that have been poured in to Ukraine, it's going to be a massive loss for NATO. They're going to lose. That they diminished their own capabilities just that much more for having given away so much ammunition, so many weapons, even the very lives of mercenaries from the West that have gone over there and been annihilated. Those mercenaries could have been the very people that rebuilt some of these shattered, hollowed out, depleted Western militaries, because they had real experience from prior wars. People like me, or you know what I'm saying. I mean, there were good men that went over there and died for a proxy conflict, in a proxy war, because they were fighting for Western globalist interests, just like anybody fighting for the Russians who volunteered to go, fight with the Wagner Group, which is basically like the Russian Foreign Legion. It might as well be. It's a Russian paramilitary organization disguised as a mercenary outfit, but it's really it's basically part of the Russian Ministry of Defense. But they try to pass them off as a PMC, but they're really not. They're just part of the Russian paramilitary forces, but they're there to basically give Russia some plausible deniability. They're there to do wet works for the Russian regime. So that's what the Wagner Group is, and they do take foreigners like Syrians and others from the Middle East have even volunteered to fight with Wagner. So. And along with other Russians. So this is like the Russian Foreign Legion. So anybody fighting for the Russians at this point, or anybody fighting for the Ukrainians, you are a pawn, you are a puppet in a proxy conflict that doesn't benefit you or anybody else. It's there to benefit these small classes of elites, whether they're the Western elites or whether they're the Russian elites or the Chinese even, because the Chinese are involved in Eastern Europe as well. We know China's been building up their troops in Serbia, Montenegro, also in Belarus, because the Chinese tank forces that have been drilling and training with the Russians outside of Moscow months back were moved further west into Belarus, because Belarus is an ally of Russia and, of course, with China. So is Serbia. They are building up their forces for the day where they're going to overrun NATO because Russia did, in fact, do a massive rope-a-dope on all the NATO nations by getting them to throw in all this money, all this equipment, all this ammunition, and even the lives of their mercenaries to be able to diminish their capabilities for the day that they're going to actually turn back around and invade NATO. There's no way that the West is going to want to get involved in Ukraine unless they just have like a death wish or something, because that's going to drag us into a war that we can't win. Hence the reason why America all of a sudden has changed its nuclear stance, because in fact we are the ones that are losing. It's not Russia. Russia is not losing. I'm not going to sit here and feed anybody a line of bullshit like these others with narratives are doing, where they're saying that Russia's losing when in fact they're not. They're not losing. In wartime, there's always propaganda. If you live in the West, you're going to hear Western propaganda. If you live in the East, you're going to hear Eastern propaganda. But I just look at the facts, the raw facts. I don't care about narratives. In fact, I try to kick all narratives in the balls. And the only reason that I'm talking up Russia is because I'm talking about the facts that actually support Russia in many cases. Because if the facts actually supported NATO, then I'd be talking up NATO. But NATO's the one sitting there looking weak and stupid, and the proxy is losing. So I have to tell the truth about that. I'm not talking anybody up or down because I care about them. I certainly don't. Because they're all evil. They're all evil. It doesn't matter if they're the West or the East. They're all evil. But in the case of this conflict, I have to tell the truth about it, and I am telling the truth. The Russians are getting ready to deal the final death blow, to do a full-scale invasion, and these forces that they've had in the East that have not been dislodged, they've not been dislodged for 7 whole months. They haven't been dislodged. These tiny forces they send in there to grind down the Ukrainian armed forces, they have not been dislodged. And they have enormous amounts of ammo, whereby the media has lied and said back in March, April, and May this past year that Russia was running out, when in fact they weren't. They were projecting onto Russia what the problems with the West are. The West is running out of things to send Ukraine. So the West had to project onto Russia that Russia was running out. But Russia, in fact, has fired 3,600,000 plus shells at 20,000 a day on average. And they're still going like the Energizer Rabbit. And this whole false narrative about them going and getting shells from North Korea, like I've said before, is total lunacy. Total lunacy. North Korea doesn't have anywhere near the stocks or the manufacturing capabilities that Russia has. They only have like a little bit less than 1/8 of the manufacturing base that Russia has for their military-industrial complex. Now, if Russia really was running low on anything, they would go to China, because China is the only nation on Earth that outproduces Russia in armaments. But China isn't an arms exporting nation predominantly. They keep most of the manufactured weapons that they build. Now, yes, China does sometimes export weapons to their allies like Pakistan, or they'll send it to Bangladesh or Myanmar, or all these different places and groups. Now, yes, China sometimes does export weapons, but they're not chiefly a weapons exporting nation. They predominantly keep about 90% of all the arms they manufacture, because they have these enormous forces that they have to arm. They're between their 4 million man active military, to their 5 million man reserves, to their 20 million man paramilitary, their parallel military forces. China has 2 militaries. They have their regular military and a paramilitary, a giant paramilitary. It's gargantuan. It's a behemoth. 20 million. China has to arm all of them. So China keeps predominantly 90% of all their arms production. China is not an arms exporter as much as they are an arms keeper. They keep most of the manufactured weapons they build. Now, Russia, they export a lot of weapons because that's part of their economy. It's part of what keeps them afloat. So they sell tanks and fighter jets and missiles abroad and things like that. But predominantly China keeps most of their arms. Now, this thing with NATO, what you have here is these Western European NATO nations, especially Germany, but Italy, Britain, and France also have let their militaries basically languish and collapse in a horrible form, basically a horrible state that they're in, to where, look, you have 1/3 of the personnel between all four of those Western European nations, only 1/3 of all the personnel that Russia has at 1,146,000, whereas Russia has 3.5 million against their 1.146 million. So then you have the tanks. Russia has 12,500 main battle tanks that are active tanks. The rest of their tanks are in the boneyards, but their active tank fleet is the second biggest on Earth at 12,500, whereas Britain, France, Germany, and Italy all combined only have 1,135 to Russia's 12,500. Then the infantry fighting vehicle armor personnel carrier category, you have Russia with 30,000 against Germany, Britain, France, and Italy's only 16,000 IFVs and APCs. I was reading the line below it. I'm sorry, y'all. Now, the specialty vehicle category, that's where I slipped up at. 15,000 is what Russia has for specialty vehicles. Russia has 30,000 IFVs and APCs to Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, 16,000 IFVs and APCs. But specialty vehicles like engineering vehicles, armored fighting vehicles, MRAPs, the whole nine, air defense artillery, there's 15,000 specialty vehicles that Russia has to Britain, France, Germany, and Italy's 11,460. Now, as for the artillery, now this is where there's a massive gap in the amounts of artillery that these nations have. Because remember what I said earlier, China and Russia are the two nations that have the most artillery on Earth. They have the most artillery systems on Earth. Now, towed artillery pieces. Russia has 7,500 towed pieces. Germany, Britain, France, and Italy only have 345. What a joke. 345 against 7,500 that Russia has. 345 towed pieces. That's what Germany, Britain, France, and Italy all have combined. No joke. Seriously. Like that's it's a joke that they have so few, but it's very serious that that's how little they have compared to Russia. Now, as for the rocket projectors, rocket artillery systems, Russia has 3,400 rocket artillery systems. Now, the rocket artillery systems of Germany, Britain, France, and Italy combined is 122. 122 against 3,400 that Russia has. Now, for self-propelled howitzers, self-propelled guns, basically, they have... Let's see here. The Germans, British, French, and Italians have 376 self-propelled pieces between all four of them. Now, Russia has 6,500. 6,500 against 376 of the four biggest European NATO contributors. That is an enormous gap in capabilities. Now, they've been keep in mind at all times that the Western European NATO nations have been trying to send weapons and ammunition to that proxy nation called Ukraine. Keep that in mind at all times. Now, remember, in the NATO war games, the NATO drills where they practice wargaming against Russia between all the NATO nations in Europe, remember, Britain and France exhaust, meaning they burn through their whole national stockpile of artillery shells in 8 days. Only 8 days. And the United States in the NATO war games went through an entire year's worth of production of shells, meaning what we produce in a year gets expended within 10 days. So if we were to actually last Well, now that we gave away 2 million shells, I don't know if we would last. But before that happened, I would have said that we maybe had 2 months worth of shells between our stockpiles and what's been produced recently per year. So we probably would have 2 months worth of shells. But now that we've given away about 2/3 of all our shells, yes, we did. We gave away 2 million shells, both 155 shells and 105 shells. We've given them away. Now, I don't even know how much of a stockpile we would have, but we are really looking weak right now. We've given away over 1/3 of our rocket artillery for the M270 and HIMARS. Absolutely, we did. In fact, you know what? Instead of Wee Fang for the thumbnail, I should have used that Institute of Strategic Studies graph I have that shows, and this is old. It's old data, but this was from months ago. This showed all the things we've given away months ago. So I should have used that as the thumbnail, but I used Wei Feng because that's the face of evil. That's the face of genocide because, he's going to be the one that wants to oversee the genocide of the American people because he said it in his speech. This video is probably going to be heavily shadow banned for what I've been saying, but you know what? I don't even care anymore. I don't care. I really don't give a damn. I'm going to say what I have to say, and it would behoove people to listen. It would really behoove people to listen because this is very serious. This is very dire information, okay? This is very serious. Instead of listening to people that don't know what they're talking about, people should listen to those who actually study this stuff. Like my friend Ken says, people should stay in their wheelhouses, and I agree with him. I totally agree with him. And I'm staying in mine because I've been researching this stuff for quite a long time. And I've been following all the military-related events that have been going on. And things are getting a little bit dangerous right now, not in the sense that there's going to be a full-scale nuclear war, because there's not going to be a full-scale nuclear war anytime in the near future. That there's not ever going to be a full-scale one. There's only going to be a massive conventional invasion of Mystery Babylon, wherein you have that mixed with some nukes, some. We're not going to get blanketed by nukes. That doesn't happen like that. It does not happen that way. If they're going to use maybe, several dozen tactical nukes when they invade Mystery Babylon, but they're massively going to use conventional armies, enormous conventional armies. It's not going to be a full-on nuke thing where they just blanket everything with nukes. That's unrealistic, and people need to listen to reason. They need to listen to reason. They need to understand that if they believe in the Bible, they believe in their word, then they know how these things are going to happen. And a lot of things haven't happened yet that still have to happen. Like I've said before, if it was two live shows ago when I said, if there is an unhinged person in the West that does a nuke FF event inside Ukraine, you are going to see the West disengage and run away faster than you've ever seen anything run in your entire life, because they're not going to want to be associated with doing such a thing, and they're going to disengage immediately, because if one unhinged group from the West or one unhinged leader carries such a thing out, has people carry such a thing out, the rest of the Western nations, the rest of their organizations, governments, nations, they're all going to disengage and run away from it because they don't want to suffer any sort of retaliation for it. That's why that would happen. But I don't see a nuke FF happening. But I'm saying if it did happen, that is the reaction you would actually see. You would see the West run away from that whole conflict faster than you've ever seen anything run before, because they're not going to want to have they're not going to want to suffer the retaliation for it. They don't want to suffer Russian retaliation, so they're going to basically repudiate all ties. They're going to sever all ties with their proxy that they've been supporting, and they're going to run away from that whole thing because they don't want their asses to get basically annihilated for it, So people need to listen to reason, and they have to understand how armies work, how people think, how things are done. It's not just going to be some random thing where all of a sudden there's just some nuke war coming out of nowhere. It doesn't work like that. It does not work like that. The Russians never said they would do such a thing. We're the only ones that said that we're considering changing our policy to a first strike policy. But here's the thing with that. A lot of our nuke arsenal is extremely old and has to be refurbished, has to be recalibrated, fixed. They have to send the nukes to the Pantex plant, which just costs an extreme amount of money to have to go through old nukes and have to, see whether they can be salvaged or if they have to be scrapped or if they have to build entirely new systems. That costs an extremely large, massive amount of money. So we have an aging nuclear arsenal, whereas our enemies have kept theirs up to date. In fact, so up to date, they have hypersonics, and China even has a step further than hypersonics. They have fractional orbital bombardment, and it's been tested, and it works. They've tested it a few times, and it works, meaning their weapons can circumnavigate the Earth, fly around the Earth, and then they can hit their target with a hypersonic glide vehicle coming down out of the air, out of the upper Earth atmosphere. That's crazy. That's crazy advanced. That's a hell of a way to up the effectiveness of your arsenal. They also can cloak their missiles from IR and also from sight because they have the paint and they also have the image cloaking systems, not that dissimilar from the old stealth suits that have been around since the 90s, where they have these mirrored stealth suit technologies. They obviously have such things for missiles. Of course, it would be massively expensive, but they could cloak their missiles. They have many different designs of hypersonics, too. At least 5 designs, and I'm talking about China. They're on, their 5th design. Russia's on their 5th or 6th. We don't even have a working model that's being mass-produced and deployed yet, mass-deployed. We don't have that. We do not have a working model that's been out of the testing phase and now being mass-produced and mass-deployed. We probably never will because our country's on the verge of collapse. Instead, we poured all this money into stupid projects like trying to make hybridized armored vehicles, which is enormously, I'm not going to say the R word, but it's enormously stupid. I don't want the video taken down because apparently now if you say the R word for, the mentally disabled word, you get taken down now. But this video needs to stay up because this is important. So they're throwing tens of billions into these stupid projects, and they're also throwing all this money at the proxy. Do people understand that we are literally propping up the entire Ukrainian economy with the money we've sent? We're funding their whole economy. That means if we disengage, they collapse overnight. And that's a fact. It is a fact. We are propping their whole economy up. We're paying their troops right now. Their economy has already collapsed in Ukraine. We are propping them up with the money we've sent and the arms we've sent. We're literally propping up their whole economy. We are paying their troops right now because they can't pay their own troops at this point. They've already collapsed, but the only reason they're still resisting is because we are propping them up with these tens of billions of dollars that we're sending to them. Now, evidently, it's over well in excess of $100 billion so far in weapons and cash that have been sent to them just to prop up their fighting forces because they can't do it themselves. They are at the point where they've been ground down enough to where their economy has fully collapsed. All the refugees that have fled from their country, that have fled the conflict, they have caused the collapse of their economy. Because imagine for a second, you have this enormous brain drain. You have a brain drain where all your best and brightest and all your shop owners, all your workers that work in factories, everybody is fleeing your country because it's a war zone. You have this massive brain drain of all your most capable people. Your economy is done. It's finished. So the only reason they're still resisting is because we are the reason that they're still fighting, because we're sending all this money and weapons. So that means that if we disengaged from supporting them, they would collapse overnight. At this point, I'm talking about at the point we're at now, all the refugees that have fled, they've literally had millions flee their country. So, and I don't blame them. I would flee too if I was some civilian, if I didn't know how to, fight. If I was just some average Joe Blow civilian, I would flee there too, because the Russians are a hell of a capable fighting force, and they haven't been dislodged. Their limited incursion that happened, they've been there for 7 months now, and they haven't been dislodged, and they're doing the same things they've done since the beginning. And now that the Ukrainians are so laser focused on fighting in the east, they're going to be overrun when this massive Russian 300,000 man fighting force that they're putting together in Belgorod and the southern parts of Belarus cross the borders and overrun the rest of that country. And there's not going to be a damn thing anybody can do to stop it. Because that force, theoretically, with as weak as the European NATO countries are, they could turn, after they take Ukraine, they could turn to the West and keep going. They could overrun all the Western nations. It wouldn't be hard, because the Western nations have these puny, depleted militaries, and they've been rope-a-doped too, just like the United States. Can you believe it? Our rocket artillery ammo for the M270 MLRS and also for the HIMARS, both use the same ammo type. We've given them over a third of all our rocket ammo. It's probably up to half by now. Our rocket artillery ammo that we need to fight a war, plus all the howitzer shells we've given, 2 million shells up to this point. That's insane. That is insane. It all came out of our stocks. What are we going to fight with? Huh? What are we going to fight with? How are we going to survive when China and Russia come in here, stomping in here and stomp a mud hole in our ass? How are we going to survive? How are we going to fight back? We don't have the military-industrial complex that we once had back in the Cold War and World War II, and you can't just jumpstart something like that overnight. All the old factories that are sitting there decaying, you're not going to just move machinery in there and revamp all these places that have already been stripped of machines and just the whole vital production lines and capabilities, and the roofs caving in and everything else. These factory complexes that haven't been used in many years, you're not just going to go in and revamp them and retool them and reset up production just overnight. It doesn't work like that. You need all these precision tools. You need a whole bunch of things. You need the experts. You need the construction capabilities. You need everybody that would go in there and know how to manufacture these munitions. You would need all of that, and you don't have people anymore that are well trained in the manufacturing of munitions. You just don't. Our society is not. For the types of munitions we have that are overly complicated, they're not streamlined. Our weapons are not streamlined, meaning they have a bunch of extra parts that are designed to break, so that the few military-industrial complex factories we do have will make immense amounts of money to send the replacement parts. But that's not practical when you're fighting another major nation. Sure, when you're fighting a counterinsurgency conflict like we fought for the last 20-some years, yeah, that works in that case. But and the people that run the few factories, they're making their money and they're happy. But you know what? Now that China has cut us off from a lot of trade and vital components and chips that we use in a lot of our more high-tech stuff, and Russia has destroyed a lot of our other stuff we've sent to that proxy, we've been rope-a-doped by China and Russia teaming up against us. So that doesn't bode well for us. We've given away all these stocks. We've hollowed ourselves out. We've depleted ourselves. And our adversaries, they're in their minds, they're playing chess while we're playing checkers. We are playing checkers while they're playing chess. There are many moves ahead of us, multiple moves ahead of us. They're setting us up for the day that we're going to get a mud hole stomped in our ass by China, by Russia. My audiobook, all my typed out stories, my documentaries of the invasion work, that's all going to happen. Even the internal conflict stuff is going to happen. My internal conflict documentary, the second American Syrian style internal conflict, that's going to happen too. In fact, that's going to happen first, even before we get invaded. Now, keep in mind, all my invasion work happens on a different timeline where we didn't have a internal conflict first. It happens a little bit different. But I wanted to show what a best case scenario for us looked like, where we didn't have an internal conflict or a collapse first, where we just had regular times and then we just got invaded. And that's a best case, and we still lose horribly. Now imagine after an internal conflict, stripping ourselves down to bare bones after fighting ourselves, how easy it'll be for the Chinese and for the Russians. They'll come stomping in here and not have any problems at all. Meaning after they take over, they won't have to fight a counterinsurgency because all the Americans' best people will have basically annihilated each other to make it easy for them to occupy this place where they're not going to have any issues. Where they're not going to have the issues of having to basically fight a conflict against partisans, insurgents, guerrillas, whatever you want to call them, because they will have already annihilated themselves for the Chinese. They would have fought each other before China came in, before Russia and other allies of China all stomped in here. So that is what's going to happen. We are going to have a collapse, a USSR-style collapse. Now, I told everybody well before August that by August we would have been in a food and fuel collapse or a food and fuel crisis. And lo and behold, by the end of the month, we were. And now the mainstream is finally catching up to the fact. I even told people that those rail strikes are just a way to cover up the fact that the diesel's low. And lo and behold, they can't cover it up anymore. They no longer can cover it up. Now even the mainstream is coming out and admitting to it. Oh, we have X amount of days left. Well, I told everybody that by August that we would be in a food and fuel crisis with the data I had available, and I was right. The only thing I was a little off on was the whole Ukraine thing. But guess what? That's about to happen too, finally. That's about to happen too. I was late on that, but you know what? At the time, anything was possible because there were a lot of old men fighting on the front lines there, and Russia's been steady grinding them down with the tiny forces they sent in there. This is going to be in the history books when it comes to war history. People are going to be studying years from now how Russia fought their war, how they sent in this tiny force that was outnumbered within Ukraine's borders and how they ground down the Ukrainian military. That will be studied for years to come because that's actually a hell of a feat for 63 to 65,000 men to go into another country and be outnumbered by tenfold and grind down that military steadily with artillery and missiles and very limited exchanges of ground where you had some instances of mobile warfare. But the Russians weren't worried about holding ground. Their objectives were to go in there, grind down the Ukrainian military, and you don't have to occupy a whole bunch of ground to do that. They were coming to them. They came to them. They came into the LPR and DPR to them. So why do they have to occupy all the land to do what they were doing? You know, they have to finish it, though, because once you start something, you still have to finish it because you cannot freeze a conflict and be like, okay, well, you know, we feel like we're done with you guys. We're going to just stop fighting you. It doesn't work like that. The Russians have to finish it, which is why they're putting together the full-scale invasion forces because they did not do a full-scale invasion. In fact, they did a limited incursion up to this point. And they're putting together their forces for the full-scale invasion that's coming. 300,000 coming from Belgorod and from southern Belarus. That's a massive force. When we invaded Iraq, we went in there with 160,000 troops on the ground, 160,000. The Russians are putting together nearly 2 times that many forces. Well, actually, it will be over that many because they're still leaving their original limited incursion forces in the east. That's the pinning force for their full-scale invasion. By pinning force, I mean it's going to pin down the Ukrainians because they're so laser-focused on fighting the limited incursion forces in the east, because they've been doing it now for months. They're going to be overrun when these massively large forces, these 300,000 man, it is a large force for invading a country the size of Ukraine. 300,000 is a lot. After their forces in the east have ground down their armed forces, these 300,000 troops are just going to run in there and have a field day. They're just going to overrun the place. There won't be a damn thing anybody can do to stop it. And like people like Gonzalo Lira or, the Duran Channel, people like that, they've got it right. They're talking about how America can't do anything about it, and they can't. Because if they try, it's going to drag us into a conflict that we can't win. Because then, guess what? We're not only going to be fighting Russia, but then we have to fight China, their ally, Pakistan, Iran, North Korea. We're going to have to fight them all if we get into a conflict with Russia. But Russia can take us by themselves. They don't need help. But China is the world's superpower. They're the biggest nation in terms of their conventional forces on the face of the earth. They have the most capable nuclear arsenal. They might not have the most nukes, but they're the third biggest nuclear arsenal, and it's the most modernized and capable because they have fractional orbital bombardment systems that work. They also have hypersonics. They have missile cloaking capabilities. China is the leader in lasers and directed energy weapons technology. They have particle colliders. We're talking about a nation that can make miniature artificial stars, okay? They lead the world also in AI and robotics, electronic warfare, and cyber warfare. China is the most powerful nation that the world has ever known, and they're Russia's ally. Russia's the number 2, but Russia, they have a bigger nuke arsenal than China, and they have more commodities than China, but China has the biggest conventional forces and the most capable nuclear arsenal, the most modernized nuclear arsenal, even though they don't have the biggest. That China is the world's superpower. They're the biggest, most powerful nation the world has ever known. And we would have to fight them if we got into it with Russia, because there are Chinese troops in Eastern Europe. There's Chinese troops inside America on CCP regime properties, in Canadian soil, in uniform, no less. Same in Mexico. They're in the Bahamas, on the CCP ports that were built in the Bahamas, and God knows what else. And they're in Cuba. They're in Venezuela. So are the Russians in Venezuela and Mexico and Nicaragua. I'm sure there's probably Russians in Canada too. Who knows? The Canadians have basically been caught in a catch-22 where their leaders, somebody's holding dirt over their heads to make them allow Chi-Com troops in their country, to allow them to set up legal bases where they don't have to hide it like they do inside of America, where they have to wear plain clothes in America and they have to hide their vehicles and their units have to pretend to blend in here. Well, they don't have to do that in Canada. They march and do PT road marches in uniform, no less, like on Salt Spring Island and other places. I've shown footage of it. Even the Canadian man taking the footage had no idea what he was even seeing. He has no idea what the ramifications are for seeing Chinese troops in uniform on Canadian soil. Same with their aircraft, their fighter jets that train regularly over London, Ontario. They're spotted regularly over London, Ontario. The Chinese have bases up there. They're ready to invade the United States. Same with Russia. Russia is enormous, and China's just ginormous. China's ginormous. They're a behemoth. There's no one bigger than China. They are the two biggest threats that we face, ladies and gentlemen. They are the two biggest threats we face. So I don't understand how America and its woke allies think they have a hope in hell of trying to fight Russia, much less China, who's even bigger. I just don't get it. I don't understand it. China has the biggest, most advanced navy on the face of the earth. They have the biggest, most advanced combat air fleet. Although not overall air force, but they have the biggest combat air fleet of combat aircraft, and it's highly advanced. They also have the largest land forces that the world has ever seen. In peacetime. In wartime, they could swell those numbers 3 to 5 fold what they are now. They're almost 30 million strong between their paramilitary and active and reserve military. They could swell that to, if you give them enough time, they could swell those numbers to 3 to 5 fold. China is not one to be messed with. I have always had anxiety about them since I was young because of their size. I always knew that they would become the most powerful nation on earth due to their population size, the size of the size of everything they have. And they have the ability to build factories like Lego men. These people build things like Lego men. They throw up whole skyscrapers in a matter of a few days. I mean, I've seen the footage of it where they do a time lapse of buildings being built in China, and these guys are like Lego men. How fast they can build things. These enormous factory complexes that they've built are just massive. I have no words to describe them. And they've built so many. They've built hundreds of these since the late 90s, and they've all come online. So for the past 5 years, China has had this just massive, enormous capability to manufacture weapons and arms and munitions and everything else, ships, all of it. There's no way to compete with them. And they lead the world in all these technologies. They're just enormous. I don't know how anybody could ever imagine being able to take on the Chinese as big as they are. China's strength lies in its people. It's massive amount of people that can build massive amounts of infrastructure and factories and weapons, lickety split when compared with everybody else. There's no competition for it. There's none. So our adversaries want to cleanse America. They want to enslave or eliminate the American people and replace them with Chinese colonists. That's what Wei Feng said, and that's what other Chi-Com leaders have said. So my audiobook, I'm giving you insight that nobody else can give you, nobody else has given, as it relates to what's coming here. So I suggest if people were wise, they would listen to that. They really would listen to that. So I'm going to dedicate the rest of this live now to my audience, and I'm going to talk to people here before I get off. I'll give some time to discuss things with the audience. Well, hey there, Lady M. It's great to see you. How's everybody doing? Hey, Kathy. Wonderful to see you, too. Who else is in here? Elizabeth De Silva. Well, great to see you, too. So, and Rebecca, wonderful. And Romero, great to see you. Who else is in here? Oh, yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah, Juan. How are you doing, Juan? And I've seen Juan Munoz. And I've seen Snafu in here. I was happy to see him, too. Snafu's a great guy. Please go visit his channel. Let's see who else is in here. Well, it's good to see everybody, and I thank everybody for coming. This was a very serious thing, and I was going to say one other thing about this drone, this haphazard drone assault on the Russian port there. You know, they did destroy some of the sea-based kamikaze drones, but they didn't. There were 2 of them that got through and actually hit targets, but they also had aircraft drones. Those were all dispatched. Those were all taken down. But see, all these provocations are not good. You know, I believe it was like 7 water-based drones, kamikaze drones, and then there were 9 in the air. You know, the airborne ones got all shot down, but the sea-based ones, they didn't get all of them. They got some, but they didn't get them all. There were 2 of them that got through. But all these provocations, you know, it's not. It keeps upping the ante to a point to where it's going to get us in a lot of trouble. So the day we do get invaded, there's going to be so much cause for them to actually carry that out to invade us, because they're going to look at us as a nation that is a state sponsor of terrorism. They're going to look at America as a state sponsor of it because of all the things that we've done. So, I'm not for anyone. I'm not aligned with anybody. I'm not aligned with the West. I'm not aligned with the East. I live in the West, but I'm not. It doesn't mean that I have to align myself with a certain set of elites. I'm neutral. All I'm doing is telling it like it is. I'm telling it all like it is because that's all I can do. As a neutral man who is a neutral observer, I am totally neutral. I'm just sitting back and I'm observing everything. I'm collecting facts. I'm a researcher, an analyst, amateur, professional researcher, an analyst who puts together information to make a bigger picture that's more coherent and clear than I would say 98% of others are giving right now, because as it relates to the military stuff, because there's a lot of different narratives, and I like to punt kick narratives whenever and wherever possible, because I don't do narratives. I do facts. I do facts here. 100% facts. I won't do any narratives. So, it's my goal to be able to provide people with the most accurate information that can be found and put it together in such a way to where it's understandable for anybody to be able to look at these things. So all these things are indeed upping the stakes. They're upping the ante, so to speak. They are upping the ante. They're upping the stakes of a confrontation. But it's my firm belief that once this proxy is overrun quickly, because I don't see our enemies, our adversaries, putting myself in their mind, I don't see them waiting to I don't see them taking forever to do this. I see them going in and being quick and decisive about it. They're going to be quick, they're going to be decisive. They're going to do it so fast that it's going to make heads spin, because it's going to blow a lot of people's minds, because a lot of people falsely believed fake narratives that Russia did a full-scale invasion when all they did so far was a limited incursion, and they thought wrongly that Russia was either in a stalemate or losing. Russia's not in a stalemate. They're not losing. They're building a force of 300,000 to bring all this to an end. And I don't see them waiting. I see them going in hard. They're going to go in hard, fast, and strong. They're going to hit hard, hit fast, and they're going to get this thing over with finally. And they're going to surprise all the people. They're going to make a lot of people look like fools when they do it. When they do this, they're going to make a lot of people look like fools. A lot of people that thought Russia was losing, they're going to make them look like fools. So I have told everybody since the beginning what's been going on. I have been steady, I've been consistent, and yet people don't want to listen to me. I think it's because of the algos, but I don't know. There's a lot of bad narratives out there that aren't true. I just like to tell the truth. I'm not for any side. I just like to sit back and look at things objectively, not subjectively. I like to look at things objectively and tell the objective truth, meaning the full 100% truth about what's actually happening based on the actions and activities and numbers and facts and figures and capabilities and stats and factoids that I see. I combine them all to make a coherent, logical, big picture. I don't do narratives because narratives are a bunch of bullshit. I do facts and figures. So that's my whole aim on this channel, is to brush away the narratives and just go straight for the jugular when it comes to facts and figures. That's what I do here. I put myself in the minds of our adversaries. What I would do if I was the Russians, because one other thing I'm going to talk about before I get off of here is I'm going to compare Taiwan to China, their military to China. Taiwan doesn't stand a chance in hell of being able to defend their island from China. Not a chance in hell. Just like America stands no chance in hell when we get invaded. Taiwan is not capable whatsoever at all to defend their island successfully against China, this monster that's right across the channel, right across the straits from them. Taiwan Straits. But if I was Russia, back to that, here's what would happen for a full-scale invasion. First, a lot of missiles would be flying out of Russia and out of Belarus, surface-to-surface missiles, whether they're the Iskander tactical ballistic missiles or whether they're cruise missiles. They have all kinds of different models of cruise missiles. The Caliber is the cruise missile called the Caliber cruise missile is the workhorse of the Russian armed forces, but they have other ones too. They have other ones. They have the I wrote it down. They have one called the SCC-08 or something like that. Hold on, let me find it. It's called the SCC-08 or something like this. Where is it? Hold on, y'all. It's a very long range one, actually. They could hit all kinds of bases of NATO, even in Europe, everywhere. Yeah, the SSC-8. It's actually a missile. It's not a cruise missile, but a ballistic missile that is truck mounted. The SSC-8, and it has a 3,000+ kilometer range. And it can hit. It's probably around the neighborhood of like 3,200. When I looked this up, it just says 3,000+ kilometer range. So it's over 3,000. So I would assume it's somewhere in the ballpark of like 31, 32. But anyway, that's far enough to hit any NATO bases throughout all of Europe, and they have a bunch of those. They have the Iskanders, which are the tactical ballistic missiles that they've been using already in Ukraine. They have Caliber cruise missiles, and they have other types of missiles, of a whole plethora of different types, and they have a lot of them. Russia has the second biggest land-based missile forces after China, and I'm talking about land-based missiles. China has the biggest ground-based missile forces on Earth. Plus, I would assume that bleeds over into their navy, like I've discussed before, because China has the biggest navy on the face of the earth. So all the cruise missiles China has for their navy are immense. Same with their combat air fleet, which is the biggest combat air fleet on earth. So they have a lot of air-launched standoff cruise missiles for their bomber fleet, for their strategic bomber fleet, and also for their fighter bombers or their ground attack tactical fighter bomber aircraft, their tactical ground strike aircraft. China has immense amounts of missiles, air, sea, and land-based, but they have the biggest ground-based missile forces on Earth. Even though they don't have the most nukes, they have a lot of conventionally armed missiles of all types. They have the biggest ground-based missile forces on Earth, and that includes their nukes, but it's mostly an enormous amount of conventionally armed ballistic and cruise missiles of all different types. So China has these big, it's called their strategic rocket forces or strategic missile forces. I've heard that term used interchangeably. It's a branch of their armed forces, of their military. There's 4 branches of the Chinese armed forces. There's the PLA-GF, which is their army, the People's Liberation Army Ground Forces. There's the PLAN, which is their Navy, People's Liberation Army Navy. There's their Air Force, the PLAAF. And then there's the Strategic Missile or Strategic Rocket Forces, which is the biggest ground-based missile forces on Earth. So China and Russia have a lot of missiles. Russia isn't even beginning to really lose their missiles. They could launch 200 missiles a day and keep going for many, many, many months. So that tells you something. It would be about 6 months, maybe 7, because Russia would, of course, keep adding missiles to their arsenal because they can build missiles. So our enemies have a lot of weaponry, especially China. So we're in trouble. We keep provoking these enemies that could destroy us and totally stomp us into the ground. But we keep provoking them. So there is definitely an East and West elites, and they're having a war for who's going to control the flavor of the NWO. Now, if I was the Russians, I would launch a massive missile strike on what remains of Taiwan. Evidently now they've already taken out most of the lights in Ukraine. That's usually what most nations do before a full-scale invasion. They take out the lights, they take out the grid. So Russia has already struck a lot of the electric grid in Ukraine. So they've been hitting substations and things like that. So what they're gonna do then is they're going to use their electronic warfare systems, like their Kirkuk system and their Murmansk systems. They're gonna jam all these different frequencies and vehicles, like aircraft vehicles and ships, whatever else they can jam with those systems, like what they did to the USS Donald Cook, where they flipped it off like a light switch. They're going to use those things on the Ukrainians. They're going to jam everything they have, all their communications and vehicles, everything. So then what they're going to do after that is they're going to do a lot of airstrikes. And I'm talking about what I would do if I was the Russians doing a full-scale invasion. Then they're going to send in their fleets of armored vehicles and mechanized infantry, and they're going to overrun the place. They're also going to send in waves of attack helicopters. So they're going to basically finish off whatever remains that they haven't ground down yet. And they're also going to lob, of course, a lot of self-propelled artillery, rocket artillery, everything that goes along with their armor and in mechanized infantry. They're going to overrun the place. So that is what I would do if I was the Russians, and that's most likely what they are going to do. Because if they're doing a full-scale invasion, we can certainly expect that. We can certainly expect that. Now, for Taiwan, Taiwan has an active military, all branches, of 165,000, and 130,000 of that is their active army. Now, they do have 1,650,000 reserves, but still, that's not very large compared to China. China is this monster sitting across from them in the Taiwan Straits. I don't even think Taiwan would have a chance to mobilize reserves. And even if they did, it wouldn't matter. I mean, their helicopter fleet is pathetic. I mean, they have 30 Apache attack helicopters and 60 UH-60 Blackhawks. They have 90 helicopters. That's all they have. That's pathetic. They also have only 1,180 main battle tanks. 930 of those are different variations of the M60A3 and the old M48 with different turrets on them. Like this, they call it the CM12 model. They also have 250 of more of those to make the 1180 total main battle tank number. So they also don't have very much artillery. Now, they ordered 40 additional Paladins, like what I was on when I was in the Army. I was on the Paladin, the M109A6 Paladin, the self-propelled artillery gun. They ordered 40 more of those from us. But the total number of howitzers they have is 625. China is on another level with all the artillery they have. They have well in excess of 15,000 artillery pieces of different types. Rocket projectors, that's towed howitzers, that's self-propelled guns. And little Taiwan has 625. Not even a competition. Not even close. China has all these missiles too. China would do much the same if they were invading Taiwan. They would launch a ton of missiles, whether from ships or from land or from air, from their strategic bombers. They would launch a lot of missiles. Also, their ground attack aircraft and their electronic strike aircraft, like the J-16Ds, would go in there and suppress air defenses so that other aircraft could fly with impunity over Taiwanese airspace once all the Patriot missile systems have been destroyed by the J-16D, which is more than capable of doing so. Same with the JH-7s, which are strictly ground strike aircraft. They now have been upgraded with electronic warfare jamming systems of the KG-600 variety, the KG-600 pods. You know, these AESA systems on the J-16D also are quite effective for jamming things. I mean, these aircrafts are extremely lethal ground strike aircrafts. Now, the J-16D is an electronic warfare ground strike aircraft. Now, they're made to take out radars specifically, like your radars for your air defense networks, like your Patriot systems. Now, they can destroy those radars from a distance, pretty fairly long distance too, and the other aircraft can fly over once the air defense network has been suppressed, and fly over with impunity and carpet munition that place into oblivion, and then they can do their beach landings and take Taiwan fairly rapidly. And the mountains that are in eastern Taiwan. Now you know the Chinese would be dropping paratroopers to take the mountains. That way there wouldn't be anywhere for whatever remained of the Taiwanese military to retreat to, because then they'd be cut off if the paratroopers seized the mountains. It would be very similar to what I've depicted in my audio book, my what was it, part 21. Now, it would be very similar to that, where they're fighting in the mountains, only it would be Taiwanese troops and it would be Chi-Com paratroopers fighting each other, but it would be a similar situation where they'd be fighting in the mountains. But Taiwan would be wrapped up fairly quick. Now, the Chinese have more than enough forces to easily overrun that place, just like they can overrun anyone else in the world, because when you have almost 30 million troops, you have 29 million total forces between your paramilitary, active military, and reserve military. You can overrun anybody. You can overrun anybody. So when you put yourself in the enemy's mind, there's all sorts of possibilities, and there's all sorts of things you could imagine that would be coming from them as far as strategic planning. So that's what I often like to do. I like to put myself in their mind and think about what they would be doing. And it's fairly easy to see what they're going to do when it comes to a full-scale invasion type of affair. When it comes to that sort of affair, I can easily see what they're going to do. So we all have to put ourselves in their minds. But I'm going to talk to people here. Hey, Monica, great to see you. Monica Velez and Cats, great to see you too. And Kathy and Lady M and Jennifer and El Romero and Rebecca and Elizabeth and Juan Munoz and oh yeah, go visit Jennifer Crocker's channel too. She has a good channel. She puts up encouraging Bible verses. Also Rebecca Rage too. She has a great channel. And also Snafu Snaps. I love his work exposing these dirty pogo agents. It's great to see you, Snafu. And you all have a wonderful night. I'm glad I could discuss these things. Yes, it is getting serious, but don't let any hype, never let any hype or misinformation or disinformation ever throw you off track. Always listen to reason, and don't ever let these crazy BS narratives and hype ever throw you off your game. So that would be my advice I could give for the night. But this has been my Tuesday Live, and I thank everybody for coming, and y'all have a blessed night.